Can you tell me? Can you tell me if you can see the screen, please?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here on a Saturday evening. I'm sure everybody has better things to do, but you still chose to be here. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you also, Hagit and Nemo for organizing the conference. I know it has been hard, Hagit, and I really admire your persistence in all this situation. I also have to say that I don't know if Hagit is taking a revenge on me for something, but when she told me that she wanted me to speak in a workshop, I never imagined that I would speak about mosques, which I have never done in front of such an audience. People who I read when I need to learn about mosques. So I like to say that my main commitment here in this conference was to listen to all of you, to learn from all of you, and basically I have learned a lot, and I have some ideas that I would like to share with you. I don't think I have anything to teach you, but I have worked a lot on Islamization, and I think that is the reason Hagit invited me. And I have thought a lot about how to think about the presence of Islam, the presence of Muslims, and the presence of Islamic culture. So I hope I can give you some of my thoughts. My narrative in this presentation is not going to be as elaborated as the narrative that I have seen. I don't have a lot of data. I'm going to talk to you about my experiences in a few archaeological sites, and I'm going to present some vignettes of life that I have seen in Muslim colleagues and Muslim people, and that have made me think a lot about how we can think about mosques when we are looking at archaeology. One of the things I would like to say is as an archaeologist, I think that we have an obligation to present a narrative which is solely based on evidence, but at the same time, I think that we also need to challenge the limits of our evidence and try to go there beyond that, and try to think of new ways of interpreting that evidence. So in that sense, I am like Hagit. I'm going to be a little bit challenging. I think not bold, but just a little bit challenging maybe, and I'm going to take the opposite way. Rather than saying, like Hagit says, we need to establish clear definitions, I'm going to say we need clear definitions, but we need to make sure that our definitions don't slave us. We need to make them work for us, rather than creating strict typologies that tie us to think beyond. And that doesn't mean that typologies are not necessary. I also would like to say, on reflecting on the previous talk precisely by Hagit, I also think that the early Islamic period is a really different war. It is a very interesting war, and I think this is what makes the archaeology of this period so interesting, because we tend to look at it with we tend to project what we know about present Islam and in that period, and I still think that we need to do this exercise of challenging the evidence to go a little bit farther, and this is why I hope that this serves as an excuse or as a reason of why I'm going to do the presentation that I'm going to do today. So my presentation is based around two questions. So what happens if we are in an archaeological site that we think is Islamic, but we find no mosque, and we find no mosque either because we simply don't find a mosque, or either because we think that there should be a mosque, but we don't find it. And I'm going to cover the two cases. And then the second part of the presentation is going to, based on the results of this question, I'm going to try to think about the meaning of ancient mosques. And you have seen that I have highlighted the word meaning, because I think it's very important, and the idea of meaning in Islam is going to have a lot of relevance in my talk today. So let me start with the archaeological project in which I basically started my career. This is the site of Medina Elvira, in which on which I did my dissertation, my PhD dissertation. I studied the ceramic of this site and of the sites around it. Medina Elvira, if you work in the Islamic archaeology of Spain, you will know Medina Elvira because it's kind of the site where everything started, as you will see. But it's a very unknown site outside of Iberia, of Al-Andalus, because it's not really a very relevant site. It's not a major site. It's not a city like Cordoba or Granada. It's the antecedent of Granada. Before there was Granada, there was Medina Elvira. But it's a completely different city and it has a completely different layout. I think it could be what Hagi termed a sort of metropolis, but in a very different sense, because this is not a city which has big monuments, but it's a city that was expanded very much in the territory. It went from, it had two alcazabat, two casabat. One of them is here. This is a quarry. The whole mount will be there in the early Islamic period. There's another casabat that you cannot see in this picture, which is farther that way. This will be the direction to Cordoba too. And then the whole of the city will spread over this plain area here. And I think it's very, very interesting because, as I said, there is a mosque here, but there is also a non-mosque, a period in which we don't have a mosque, and we probably should have a mosque. So let me start from the beginning. Medina Elvira was excavated for the first time in the late 19th century. It's one of the earliest excavated Islamic sites in the world. It was excavated mainly because of a local question. So there was a local controversy in the intellectuality of Granada in the late 19th century. Some people thought that Granada was the place where Elvira, the city of Elvira, had been. Some other people argued, based on different sources, that Elvira was in a different place, which is where it eventually was found to be. And the city of Elvira was excavated by Manuel Gómez Moreno, which is the person that you have in the picture. He was a painter, he was an amateur archaeologist, and he was a sort of a genius because he made a lot of interesting discoveries, not only in Islamic archaeology. He's the founder of Islamic archaeology in Spain, but he also made important contributions in Roman and in Iberian archaeology. So he basically excavated the site and he found the mosque of Medina Elvira. The mosque was found in 1888, and then it was lost again for 100 years. Still, we don't know if we have the mosque, as you will see. And in the mosque, he found, for example, these three lamps that you can see here, which are now in the Archaeological Museum of Granada, one of them. The other two are in the National Archaeological Museum. He also found a lot of ceramics, which were used to define the Islamic pottery of Al-Andalus at the beginning. So this could be the kind of the Samarra of Al-Andalus. Obviously, all his definitions are no longer valid. They are very outdated, but the pieces are still there. And if you go to the archaeological museum and have the chance to look at them, you will realize that they have the first numbers of the inventory. So numbers 1 to 10 or so are the ceramics of found by Manuel Gómez Moreno. Now, the city of Elvira was found, as I said, in the late 19th century, and then it was lost again. People forgot about it. They were not interested in it. It was not a city defined by its monuments. The mosque was found, and then it was brought down so that the stones of the mosque could be reused to do other building projects. And then everything was lost again. And it was not until the early 21st century when a new project directed by Antonio Malpica Cuello focused on the city of Elvira again. And he excavated in Elvira for 3 seasons. He also did a number of other excavations, and other people working with him did also other excavations. So there's a number of archaeological interventions in the city from between 2001 and 2009. That will be the last formal excavation by Antonio Malpica Cuello. And then there was another project. There is another project going on by a Polish scholar, Professor Marian Rewkowski, I think is his name. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. I'm really bad with the foreign names. And he is the one that has probably found the Mosque of Madinah Elvira. And I say he has probably found it because I don't know for sure, because this is a very recent discovery and nothing has been published yet, although he gave a conference recently, and in an admirably cautious way, he presented the results, suggesting that it could be the mosque, and it could be very, very likely. Now, this is interesting because in 2007, the second campaign of the project of Antonio Malpica Cuello, we excavated the area of the plain area of Elvira, trying to find this mosque, and we couldn't find it. The area that we excavated in search of the mosque was more or less here. It's an approximate area. This is not I have not used any mathematical or topographical information. I have just gone to Google Maps and used more or less my orientation to place the area of excavation, but it was more or less there. And this was our base. There was a building here that we used as a base to store the ceramics, to study them, etc. And funny enough, the excavations of Professor Rewkowski seem to have found the mosque precisely under we were excavating, precisely under we were storing the pottery. So we were not that far away, but unfortunately we didn't find it, and I really hope to have more results on Madinah Elvira soon. And now, what is interesting about the mosque of Madinah Elvira is that this mosque is very late. Here is this is the best dating evidence that we have. Sorry, Hagi, we don't have any other dating evidence for the mosque of Elvira. It was founded in 864. Now, if you remember dates, Al-Andalus was conquered by the Muslims in 711. The town of Elvira, we don't know when it was founded, but it could have been founded shortly before the Muslims arrived in Spain, or it could have been founded shortly after the Muslims arrived in Spain. We don't even have that information. Al-Himyari thinks that the mosque was founded by the Muslims. It's a possibility, but we are not sure. The only thing that we know is that there was a popular legend when Al-Himyari wrote, and it has been replicated by other authors, that a quasi-mythical figure, Hanas al-Senani, one of the conquerors of Al-Andalus, arrived in Elvira during the conquest, and he founded the first mosque in Elvira. And this is when, and it is this mosque that was substituted by the new mosque that was founded in 864. Now, if you remember the presentation of Carmen, 864 will be a good date to relate to the period in which one of the amirs of Cordoba started to found mosques all over Al-Andalus. So the mosque of Elvira, which according to the sources was founded by one of the amirs of Cordoba, could have been founded very well in that time period. But it is interesting that all the sources point that there was a previous mosque founded by this semi-mythical figure. And it is interesting because this semi-mythical figure, it's almost proven that didn't exist, or if it existed, it never went to Al-Andalus. Hanas al-Senani is supposed to be a tabi'un, which is a companion of one of the companions of the Prophet, meaning he never met the Prophet, but he met people who had met directly the prophet, and that was enough to give him a lot of charisma that was very relevant for its role in the conquest of Al-Andalus. So he's the founder not only of the Mosque of Elvira, but he's the founder of a lot of other mosques. So, for example, Zaragoza, I think Merida, and if we ask Carmen, probably he has a few more data about other mosques supposedly founded by this character. Now, what is interesting is that we don't know what is the role of Hanash. We don't know if there was a mosque before. All we know is that there is a mosque in Elvira, at least from 864. But before that, we don't know if there was a mosque or not. But there is a very clear interest in the sources written afterwards to say, obviously, there was a mosque before. Okay. Now, let me go to a different site. And this is a site that I have excavated most recently. So if Elvira was my first project, my latest project has been the Crowded Desert in Qatar. And here I have worked in a little area of the northwest of the country, looking for evidences of nomadic settlement in relationship to settled populations. Now, my project covered the whole range of dates that we could find. And I won't go into all the details of every date, but of course I had a lot of interest in the early Islamic period. And in the early Islamic period, we managed to do an excavation in a very interesting site, the site of Jugbi, which you can see in the picture. Jugbi was located in a survey. I mean, the site had been known before by previous surveys by Beatrice Lecardi. It was published by her in 1978, and obviously it was known by the Bedouins ever since the beginning. This is a small site. It's a semi-nomadic site, which was, by semi-nomadic, I mean that it seems to have been occupied by nomads which were in a process of sedentarization. And we know this because we have a period of frequentation, and then we have a period of building, and then it's very quickly abandoned again. Another important feature of this site is very close to the most important early Islamic site, Murwab, about which I will talk immediately after. And we decided to dig here in 2018, which was the last field season of the Crowded Desert project, because of the survey dates of the dates suggested by the material recovered in the survey, which were the early 7th and very early Islamic period, 7th, 9th centuries. So we excavated there. We found all these buildings. We made 5 trenches, and I love to go into details because I love this excavation. But I will just give you a very quick overview. So we found these different buildings, which, as I said, are of a site which is in a process, seems to be in a process of sedentarization. We managed to recover enough carbon to do some radiocarbon dates of the different stratigraphical phases that we found. So we have 3 very clear stratigraphic phases, which will be phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And then we have evidence which was very dubious of previous phases. So I have put them on the top of the table there with a question mark and with an X, because I'm not using that evidence for the purposes of my interpretation. But now the most interesting part of this evidence is the very early dates that we had in the survey were confirmed, and more importantly, we have phase 2, which is the phase of the buildings, is where we recover more material. Basically, the most important parts of the most relevant bits of the material culture that we recover were from phase 2. And just to give you a quick overview, we have ceramics from a whole range of places, including turquoise green glaze ceramics from probably from Iraq, pottery shells that have been identified as Indian vessels. We also have a lot of other finds of other materials, including soapstone vessels, glass fragments, metal, shells. And this is a very wide range of materials for a very simple nomadic group, which makes it really interesting. And then what I find the most interesting bit of the assemblage of materials that we found is this set of net weights that were found in situ, meaning that the net weights have been abandoned in a building, holding together from a same thread, and they were holding from a wall, hanging from a wall, and the wall collapsed, and then we found the nets as they would the net weights as they would have been threaded together. So we can reconstruct the disposition that they have. Now we don't know if they were in a net or if they were in a single thread. It's a very small set for a whole net, but it could have been a small net maybe for catching birds. Anyway, the interesting thing of this is that the different nets are made mostly from pottery. There's one made from stone, and we can identify the pottery types. So we have 4 of them at the bottom here, which were specifically made. We know they were specifically made because they had a little bit of bar around the hole. So basically, someone shaped them and prepared them as weights originally. We have the one in stone, but then the rest of them are of typical types of pottery, which come from further away, from quite far away. So we have torpedo jars. This one here, we have a glazed turquoise fragment. We have a list ware, which it's not very clear where it comes from, but certainly not from Qatar, probably from South Iran. And then we have these common wares, which again were not produced in Qatar. They could have been produced in southern Iran. So overall, what we have here is a very small site, a very small community, but incredibly well connected with everything that is happening around them. And this is very interesting. But what we didn't find was a mosque. We didn't find a mosque here. We thought that we could have a mosque because one of the, in the aerial picture that we were able to take, one of the buildings seems to have a mihrab, but we excavated very carefully that building, and we could check that there was no mihrab. So, and there is no other candidate there for a mosque. I mean, we could have a temporary mosque, a musalla, but it had not been constructed, definitely. And this is interesting because, as you saw in the chronology before, Jogbi is very clearly early Umayyad, and in Murwab, which is the early Islamic site, which is very close to it, Murwab has a slightly later chronology, early Abbasid, and it goes to it links with the last phase of Jogbi, which is a reoccupation phase. So there's a period in which both sides could have been occupied together. And then Murwab appears with 2 mosques, and it's a very different site. It's also considered to be by its excavators, Alexandre Geran and Faisal Naim, who have kindly provided me with this picture, by the way, so my acknowledgement to them. So it is considered to be 9th century on the basis of the pottery that they found. And it is also considered to be a semi-sedentary place in the sense that it's a site where you can read the sedentarization of nomads, but it's very different. It has very different features. The houses have square corners, which is something that we don't have in Jogbi. It is associated to this little fort here, and it is associated to 2 mosques, which we have not been able to identify. Now, this is interesting because, as I said, Jogbi, you have this, you have the faces of Jogbi there. You have the interesting phase 2. It's, as I said earlier, Umayyad before, it's plainly Umayyad, as you can see. And you have a wider, if you consider the whole faces of the site, without considering the outward dates of the chronology. You have one chronology that goes from the late Sasanian period to the early Abbasid period. And it is incredibly well connected to a world around it that is dominated by the presence of the Muslims around it. Obviously, the people in Jugbi could perfectly be Christians. We have a lot of evidence of Christian sites in the Gulf in this period, but they are usually connected to churches and monasteries, and there was no church in Jogbe either. So Jogbe could be something in between, could be anything from Muslims to Christians, they like to say maybe pagans, we don't know. But the thing is that they are incredibly well connected to this site in which Muslims are present everywhere. So that made me think a lot. How could we interpret Jogbe in this Islamic world? Okay. So what I'm going to propose here in the next of this, to continue with my presentation, is I'm going to take some assumptions here. None of these assumptions is necessarily true, okay? But I'm going to suggest to think on the lines of this idea. So what if the inhabitants of Jogbe were Muslims in spite of not having a mosque? Okay, and what if the Ahl el-Bira, the inhabitants of Medina el-Bira, were Muslims and they didn't have a mosque before 864, when we know that the Umayyad mosque was founded? And that will mean, basically, what if we could talk about mosques, we could talk about Muslims up to that period at least, not being a necessary marker of Islamic community? What if we could have Islamic communities without mosques? Okay. So let's go to the next part of my presentation, and let's think, for example, how could we interpret the absence of mosque? And one very simple way of looking at the absence of mosque in a place like Jogbe, for example, and this is particularly related to Jogbe, is to think about them having musallas to pray rather than having fixed mosque. And this wouldn't be impossible because musallas are everywhere. One of the things that we found out in the Crowded Desert project, in the survey that we did in this area of Qatar, is that you could find musallas everywhere. And you could find them in very different shapes and in very different sizes. They were always defined by a mihrab. Sometimes the mihrab was the only thing that you could find, a simple arch of stones. Sometimes they were very elaborated, like this one here, which has a full enclosure besides the mihrab. And sometimes they were not even small, they were really big. So this one here had a mihrab which was more than a meter deep and had a really wide wall. Originally, when we found it, we thought it was a mosque. And then talking to other people, particularly Richard Cutler, who's another surveyor of Qatar, was very helpful here. They suggest that it could be a musalla for festivals, for gatherings of large crowds of people in the desert, which is a phenomenon. And I think that is a more correct interpretation. So it is possible to think of Islamic communities that don't necessarily live to buildings known as mosques. So if we start questioning this concept of the mosque, then maybe we can start questioning these ideas about all the controversies of the shape of the mosque. And I think I like to give a reminder of something that Carmen has said in her wonderful presentation about the elasticity of the mosque, the elasticity of the different elements of the mosque to be orientated in a different way or to be arranged in a different way so that it could fit the needs of a community rather than a particular typology of how we think. Now, we have, as archaeologists, we tend to think of mosque as something that comes very clearly shaped. So, for example, a recent work that I enjoyed very much reading, I think it's a really good work by Antum. She suggests that the mosque is that the earliest form of the mosque congregational mosque at least can be dated to the mosque of Wasit, according to evidence excavated by Fuad Safar in 1945, and which she reviewed very carefully. I know that I have looked at the database of Hagir. I know that she doesn't agree with the dates. I tend to agree with this date, but anyway, the important thing of this argument is not so much the date, it's the way in which the archaeologists tend to think about the form of the mosque. That's something that it's given from a particular period. For Antum, the mosque is clearly given a very well defined, a very well given form from the mosque, from the moment in which you have the building of Wasit. She also suggests that actually this form could have been earlier. She believes, according to evidence that she studies, that the Mosque of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, it's an earlier manifestation, but she doesn't have the evidence to prove it. But still she thinks that Al-Aqsa, and therefore an earlier period, at least the Sufyani period in the Maya period, is the moment where we should start thinking that the mosque was acquiring a particular shape. And obviously, with all the evidence that we have seen in the last 2 days, I think that, I mean, with the work of Denis, the work of Jeremy, the work of Luis, I think there's no question that if we are going to admit that there is a shape of a mosque that we need to look for, it should go earlier. We also have this question of this difference between rural mosques and the shape of this mosque, and in particular we have all these very interesting excavations in Israel. We found, I think that most of these excavations will be dated usually later, but at least there's a claim by John Seliman and Shahan Zur, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, apologies for my Hebrew, that a mosque recently excavated in Nahat Tahar it can be dated to the 8th century. So again, we could see that there is here a search for a typology, for a form that can tell us what is Islamic, what is a mosque from the 8th century, at least. Now, this is all very interesting. This is all a very necessary work. I'm not going to say that we don't have to search for shapes of mosques, or that we don't have to use typologies at all. But if we are looking for markers of Islamic community, and if you ask Muslims, it is very probable that for the Muslims that you ask, a lot of them, in my case, I have seen that a lot of them are much more interested, or are for them an actual marker of Islam will be the Quran or the Shahada, that is the text of any representation of the Quran, any representation of the text of the Quran. But that is, of course, not easy to find. It's very difficult to find copies of the Quran, and mosques offer us a much more solid evidence. That is a basic principle of Islamic archaeology, of any archaeology, indeed. But let's think a little bit about the materiality of this. So I could give you the example of one project that we did in Qatar. We are a group of people working in UCL Qatar. We did this project called Materiality and Preservation in Islamic Context, which was funded by the Qatar National Foundation, by the Qatar National Fund. And one of my colleagues there, Vula Golfomitsu, she's a conservator. She studied within the context of this project the practices of conservation of Islamic objects, and she gave us a lot to think in terms of what is important for people for Islamic people, would say, for Muslims, about conservation. What is the value that they want to conserve in sacred objects? And whereas in many instances, in instances in which there was no written text on objects, there were no significant difference. There were very important differences in objects in which text was inscribed in objects. So when Vula was asking people of the public, Muslim people of the public, about what is important to conserve in an object, if this object has any kind of sacred writing on top of it, the Muslim will always prioritize the possibility of reading the text, even if the conservation practices had to be adapted to this, even if this was not the way in which a professional conservator will work normally. And this work even for conservators themselves. When Muslims have been trained as conservators, they found it difficult to consider objects in a way that would not make the text more readable, more easy to read for the audience. So I think that is very important, because that is telling us that there is a different way of looking at objects related to Islam that sometimes we might miss if we think too much in terms of our own typologies. So for Muslims, for the Muslims at least that we ask in Qatar and in other Islamic countries nearby Qatar, there was this very clear need to subordinate the material to the codes that allow the object to be read as Islamic. Now, how can we interpret this in archaeology? Okay, so let me go a little bit into theory, because I like theory a lot. One of the things that we do when we think about Islam, and I think we all do it, is that we tend to consider Islam as something that is already formed, that is already shaped, and therefore something that has to be, to which Muslims had to adapt either as practitioners or either as believers. So in a way, Islam is something that is finished, and then it is manifested in a particular form, and then Muslims have to accept that form as it is given. Okay, this is our own conception of it. I will criticize our own Western conception of Islam. So we discuss in terms of faith and practice. So faith is about believing in the orthodoxy that is given, in the shape that is given, and practice is about practicing, using the forms that are given. Now, if we look at some other works, and I'm particularly looking here at the work of Shahab Ahmed, what is Islam? Shahab Ahmed was, unfortunately, he passed away, was an Islamic, a Muslim scholar who was very well versed in the study in Islamic studies from a Western perspective. And he offered a very thorough critique of Islamic studies, very respectful, but very thorough, of Islamic study. And I think he gave it a very interesting idea about how we can understand Islam. So for him, Islam, or in his conception, Islam is not something that is already formed and shaped. It's something that is gaining shape every time that a Muslim interprets it. Or rather than Muslims, he talks about Islamic people. I won't go there. I'll just leave it with Muslims. But basically, for Ahmed, Islam is being shaped continuously. Every time that there is a shape form in Islam, it's because a Muslim is looking for a way to understand the meaning of the revelation of the Prophet to Muhammad in the world. And then that understanding, that meaning is interpreted in the material world, and that also goes again to shape the formation of Islam. So basically, Islam is being shaped continuously in a cycle by which, in which Muslims create new meanings that serve to future Muslims to create new context, new formation of Islam. I will leave it there, but I'm very happy to discuss this further if you want to talk about this. So rather than discussing about the a lot of the time, rather than discussing about when the shape is formed, we should try to understand the shapes that we see. And in this case, we are talking about mosques. We should try to understand the meanings of what we see in the archaeological record, rather than trying to create whole typologies of everything, thinking that the typologies are going to give us the answer. I think that the typologies can give us an answer, but they can also help us to raise questions. So 2 examples here, 2 quick vignettes that I would like to present. At some point, I was in Qatar working with colleagues of the Qatari the Qatar museums, and I was working in particular with a Qatari who was the boss of this particular team, an Egyptian and a Syrian. Okay, and at some point they made a stop in the field to go for a pray, and I just watched from the distance. And to me, it was interesting on the discussion on who was going to lead the prayer. And the discussion is not at all for what you would think. They were not discussing on who should lead the prayer. They were discussing on who should not lead the prayer. The option of the Syrian leading the prayer was discarded very quickly because he was the youngest. But then there was a question in between the Egyptian and the Qatari. The Egyptian wanted the Qatari to lead the prayer because he was the boss. Whereas the Qatari said, no, you have to lead the prayer because you are the older. At least I believe that you are the older. That's a different question. The Qatari was of nomadic origin, so he didn't know exactly his date of birth, but he believed that he was younger than the Egyptian. And of course, the Egyptian didn't dare to say, no, you are actually older than me. Anyway, in the end, it was the Egyptian who led the prayer because of this dispute, because this was the result of this completely friendly discussion between them. That for me was very interesting because it shows that there is a very well-structured hierarchy even when they are praying in the middle of the desert. So you don't need a mosque to establish, you don't need any fixed structure to establish a certain hierarchy. That hierarchy can emerge out of the group of people who are praying. Now, a different vignette. This happened to me in Egypt, in Cairo, when I was visiting the Al-Hakim Mosque. Of course, I was very interested in the archaeological and artistic and historical aspects of the mosque. But I was attracted. I felt interested in the fact that there were a group of teenagers in the mosque. Some of them were very clearly, there were boys and girls. They were behaving, of course, very respectfully, but they were clearly flirting in between themselves. To me, it looked like something very interesting because I never thought that, when I was a teenager, I never thought of bringing the girl that I like to a church. But the mosque obviously is not a church. It's a completely different place. It's also a gathering space. And it is the ideal place if you want to bring someone and to show that your relationship with that person is completely legitimate. Because if you are a boy and you take a girl to a different area of the town, maybe you are actually creating a problem for yourself and for the girl. But bringing them to a mosque actually it's a very powerful statement to say, we're actually not doing anything wrong. Our relationship is perfectly fine. So I thought that was very interesting, and I thought that shows that even in a very powerfully structured space like a mosque, you can also find space for this kind of different uses in which the part of Jamia is more relevant than the part of Masjid, if you want. So maybe we could think about these early Islamic mosques precisely in those terms. These early Islamic mosques are spaces which are at the same time a structured space for prayer, and they tell very clearly what is the hierarchy in prayer. And when you get a very important mosque. You get something like you get the maksura, you get a minbar, you probably have a very well known imam, and you will have the khutbah every Friday. And those are very clear material signs of the structure within a mosque. But at the same time, the mosque is also a place for meeting. That's the whole part of Jamia. And it's also a place where meeting is going to be allowed within certain parameters. So it is the ideal place to meet. So perhaps that is a way in which we could think about the mosques in the early Islamic period, and how this mosque emerged. And we could think about all these structures. And I think I would like to say, I think that the discussion that Abed and Carmen had before about the fact that you have, for example, let me go back to this mosque in Cordoba. You have the mosque in Cordoba, and then you have minor mosques around the city. Abed made a very interesting point that these are different. These are masjids. They are not exactly the same as the mosque al Jamia. I think that's a very interesting point. And we could think about the hierarchization of mosque also in that point. Maybe the small mosques are spaces that are not supposed to be, they lose the Jamia part, and they are more focused in becoming masjids. But I don't think that if we create that structural typology, we could apply it to everything. And this is why I come back to this image of the musallas. I don't think that necessarily the very well-structured hierarchy between a Jamia mosque and a small neighborhood mosque can be applied to every different bit of architectural, of religious architecture, or every bit of the Islamic world. So I think we need to be careful here. So for example, if we wanted to structure this musalla, how will we do it? How will we go about it? Because maybe this is more important because it's better structure, it's close, but this is maybe most important because this is bigger. So there are some questions there to take into account. So the last part, and I'm going to finish very soon, is about the fabric of Islam and what is the role that mosques play in this. And this is, I think, a really relevant part to discuss about the role of the mosque and the meaning of the mosque. So in another vignette, again, coming back to Qatar, at some point in early 2014, my colleague Trinidad Rico and I went to the Qatar Museums Authority. Now it's the Qatar Museums only, and to talk to the people in charge of conservation, because we were aware that they were having a project on conservation of mosques, of old mosques in the country, and we thought that was very interesting, and we wanted to understand the way that they went about it, the way that they prioritize the mosques that had to be conserved, and which methodologies they use, etc. And one of the questions that we asked them was, what happens if a mosque has to be destroyed because of development, or because it's very old and there's no way to save it? And they said, we have consulted with Islamic scholars in this sense, and the answer is very clear. You can destroy a mosque as long as you build another one in its place. And I thought that was, again, very interesting, because this shows that mosques are not unique buildings in themselves. They are part of a fabric, and this is a way in which we should be looking at them too. A clear example of that, for example, you can find it in the plan of Doha. In Doha, it's a city, it's the capital of Qatar, of course. It's a city that has undergone a lot of changes since it was created, but one of the biggest changes is from the 1950s to the present. And here you can see how a mosque appeared very close to the Al-Quds Fort out of nowhere. So here you can see the picture of 1959. I have taken this from the project of my ex-colleague Robert Carter in Qatar. So in the 1950s, there's this space which is basically covered by buildings, And suddenly, in the present, this mosque appear, and you can see the mosque here now. This is the current Google image of the same area. This is a fort, and this is a mosque right here. According to Rob, to my colleague Rob Carter, this mosque was moved from a different place. Although I have not been able to locate that place, and I have not been able to talk to Rob about this. There was also new mosques being founded. So in this corner here of the picture, a new mosque was founded. So it is also possible to create new mosques. So in a sense, the texture of Islam is not something that is fixed. It can change. And I think that Carmen also made a really interesting point about this in Cordoba. Now, the texture of Islam, I don't think is something that is going to be very controversial for anybody. We see this in the way in which different buildings, different functions become associated to the mosque ever since the very early Umayyad mosque, which appear associated to shops and markets or baths or ablution rooms. But also in later Islamic periods, so for example, the Selimiye Mosque in the Ottoman Edirne, it's associated to madrasas, it's associated to a souk, it's associated to a cemetery, and even to a school for children here. So we can see that there is ways in which mosques appear associated to other elements that change along. And this is why what I think it's a way of understanding changing in the material texture of Islam. We know that it's important for the Muslim authorities, for the Islamic authorities, because they're ready to destroy mosques or spiritual centers that they don't recognize. I mean, we have the examples of the sanctuaries of Shia sanctuaries being destroyed by Islamic State in the more recently. But we have very early examples like the Masjid, the episode of the Masjid al-Dirar and the Munafiqun in the Quran, which is in the period of Muhammad, in the period of the Prophet, a mosque was built by a community who wanted to create an alternative center of power to that of Muhammad, and Muhammad reacted, ordering the destruction of the mosque. But we also see that in certain tendencies of, for example, in Wahhabism, destroying or raising places where great worshipping can be done. And this is because they want to have a clear control of the texture of the material texture of Islam. But we also see this in Medina al-Bira. This is, remember, the area of that was excavated in 2007, where we didn't find the mosque. We didn't find the mosque, but we found something very interesting. We found the remains of a cemetery, and in the cemetery there was this tomb in particular, which had two faces. And the big change of the tomb is the tomb had been originally a very simple and very normal tomb, and at some point it had been modified. Walls around the tomb have been added, and these big stones, big ashlar stones, have been put on top of the tomb as a way to mark it somehow. Because of the dating of the tomb, we can relate this change of the tomb to the construction of the Umayyad mosque. I mean, it's not a 100% matching, but it seems very clear that the reformation of this area of the cemetery is related to can be dated to the late 9th century, which is the period when shortly after the Umayyad mosque was built, or maybe early 10th century is the maximum period. So we see how the documentation of a mosque, the appearance of a mosque, and in this case of an al-Jami, of a Friday mosque, can change things around it. I'm running out of time. I'm almost finished, but I just wanted to finish some examples with some examples. A very quick one. There's a very interesting article, very interesting text by Jeffrey Fletcher, in which he explains this change in mosque construction techniques in the Swahili coast that Stefan was mentioning before, in a different way than most scholars take it. I don't have elements to criticize or accept this approach of Fleischer, but I think it's very interesting to consider it. So basically, he says that rather than this mosque, the transition of mosques of being made of mud and wood to stone, to coral stone, rather than being due to the influence of Persian communities, it was due to the change in the economy of the communities, which became much more involved in trade and became much more involved in the activities related to the coast, and therefore they became much more interested in they became much more acquainted with the materials that they are there and with the spiritual world of those materials. So therefore they wanted to include that in their mosques. And therefore, in this case, what you will have here is a physical change in the building techniques of the mosque, reflecting a different change in the texture, in the material texture of Islam, which is related also to the material texture, to the economic texture, to the economic fabric of the society. Okay, and the last vignette, I'm finishing very quickly here now. I'm taking you to Butrint, which is an archaeological site in South Albania. This is not an archaeological site, although it was under Ottoman control. But rather than to Butrint, which is this site here, I'm taking you to Shara, this little village here, which I surveyed with a team in 2010. And I surveyed it because I have been asked by the people in Butrint to find out about the Ottoman phases of Butrint. And Shara happened to be the only village around where there is a mosque. So there should be an Islamic community in Shara. The rest of the villages are from Christian communities. They have churches, but they don't have mosques. So we went to Shara, and it was very interesting because what we found there is that indeed they have a mosque, but the Muslims of the village don't go to the mosque. They go to pray to the church. And we could witness this because on the Friday, the day in which the mosque should have been full of people, the mosque was absolutely empty. The only people who went there was the imam, and the imam was very kindly enough to open the mosque for us. We saw that there was nobody there. When we asked the imam and when we asked other people, they told us, no, the Muslims in this village prefer to go to the church of St. Nicholas when they had to pray, because they reject the mosque because of doctrinal differences. We understood. So the mosque is Sunni, and the Muslims of this village, of this part of Albania, are Bektashis. But it is also it also shows how the fabric of Islam is not necessarily reflected in the physical structure of the mosque. And I think that gives up a very interesting case where you have Muslims and you have a mosque, but they are not related at all. Now, this thing could have changed. This was 10 years ago. Maybe if you go to Shara today, maybe you have Muslims visiting the mosque. Maybe there was a period of transition there. But I think it's a very interesting thing to have into account. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there. I had 2 more slides, but these were basically to come back to Qatar and to come back to Joby and to reflect on how the texture of Islam can also impact in communities that are not necessarily Muslims. So we could undo the questions that I gave you at the beginning. Let's say that the people in Jogby are not Muslims. Will that change a lot of things? I will say not really. I mean, maybe the people in Jogby are not Muslims, were not Muslims, but they were certainly Islamic people. They were deeply embedded in a network of relations and of materials, which made them understanding of many elements of Islamic culture. For people like Shahab Ahmed, whose book I mentioned before, that will be enough to make them Islamic people, even if they are not formally Muslims. So I think that's also another thing that we have to take into account. And I think I will leave it there because I just hit the hour of talking, and I would rather have a conversation with you. And this is basically some ideas to think about. So mosques can be markers of Islam. I won't say that they are not markers of Islam, but their absence cannot be interpreted as the absence of Islam, nor its presence can be interpreted as the presence of Islam or a particular branch of Islam, unless we have more data. Mosques are part of the material fabric of Islam, and this is the fabric from which Islamic people, Muslims, if you want, make meanings, searching for the meaning of the revelation. And this is in reference to Shahab Ahmed. And mosques are focal points within this material fabric of Islam, and therefore we need to study them. Of course, I'm not saying that we shouldn't study mosques, but we need to make sure that the study is not made in isolation, and that the study is mixed with all the context around them. And this, I think I'm reflecting the spirit of this meeting. As I said, I'm not presuming of teaching anybody anything here in this meeting, but I hope that my ideas at least have been interesting and maybe thought-provoking to any of you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I leave it there.